In the last video I mentioned that the poem is mostly lyric, right? Maybe some of you will think of it as a philosophical ranting a lot. But we saw a couple of short passages of narrative, right? And if we look in section 35, it's on page 1040 in the PDF packet, here we have a section that's almost entirely narrative. Would you hear of an old-time sea fight? Would you learn who won by the light of the moon and stars? Listen to the yarn or the tale. Listen to the yarn as my grandmother's father, the sailor, told it to me. And then he goes on to recount the actual story. And so, although the poem in a lot of places is lyrical, it's also got sections of narrative, right? And so the poem itself is pretty diverse. And that's something I want to talk about. It is a diverse poem. And these are not 52 individual poems, right? They're all part of a single song of myself. So what does that seem to suggest? Well, I think it suggests that the self itself is pretty diverse, right? And I think that's something, if we reflect on our experience here on planet Earth, we can be pretty diverse creatures. We have diverse interests. We can be complicated creatures. We can be contradictory creatures. If you think of section, is it 9 and 10 or 19 and 20, where we sort of bring up, we summon some of the allusions from the Bible, and then the next section we sort of undercut them. You can, maybe you simultaneously believe and don't believe. That's part of the experience of being a human. And I think that's one reason why Whitman chooses to group all of these things into what he calls a single poem. And so it's the song of myself, right? It basically says that the self is very diverse. You have to have a big poem in order to encompass the totality of the human experience, right? Which I also think is why we have such long lines. This is a poem that includes a lot of things, right? There are lots of lists. The lines are very long. And I think that you need to have those lines. If you're going to have a poem that tries to encompass everything, you need to have lines that try to encompass everything. Can you imagine this poem of, maybe of lines that are made up of maybe 6 or 8 syllables each? It would have a much different feel, right? And so what I think the line choice, maybe he's deliberately trying to break with tradition, but I also think it's a utilitarian sort of thing where, he's trying to fill the poem with as many things as possible. And so in order to squeeze out all the space that he can, he's using these really long lines. And I think that lends itself to the purpose of the poem. It's not just a poem of myself, right? It's a poem of the country. He calls, the United States perhaps the greatest poem. And so I think the same sort of diversity is present in the United States as is present in the self, right? We talk about, I'm a poet of the body as much as a poet of the soul. I am a poet of the man as much as the woman. He's protecting the slaves. There are different parts. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about him. But it's often speculated that he was a homosexual, and so there are these sort of erotic passages. He talks about loving men, especially in some other poems. So he seems to be very diverse, right? And so there's this big poem, not just to encompass the totality of the human experience, but also to encompass the totality of the American experience, right? It's not just a poem of an individual; it's a poem of an entire country. He was a nurse in the Civil War. And so he saw the country literally divided against itself. So I don't think that it's a coincidence that he talks about equality or people coming together, that he is a poet both of the man and the woman. He doesn't divide them. He doesn't divide white from black, slave from slaveholder. They're all equal, right? And I think that comes out of his experiences in the Civil War. So yes, it is a poem of the self, but it is also a poem of the country. And I think that the form, the long lines, just the length of the poem, all the different sections of the poem, they reflect that. Because I don't think you can write a poem of the self in a couple of pages, right? In a couple of pages of short lines. At least maybe you couldn't at that time. The form here is serving what Whitman is trying to do. He's trying to encompass, right? He's trying to bring everyone in. He's basically stretching his arms wide open and saying, you man, you woman, you straight, you gay, you slaveholder, all come in. We're all part of the same community, right? And I think that's what he's trying to accomplish. And so in a way, the long lines seem to embody this gesture of bringing everyone in. They seem to encapsulate. They literally reach across the page, right? So when we think about form, I think that's another thing that the form is doing. And it allows him to have more space to bring people in. So I just wanted to mention that this is a pretty diverse poem. It's got lots of sections. The sections are not all the same. There are lyric passages. There are narrative passages. He talks about a lot of different things. Sometimes he's contradictory. But I think that's all purposeful. And I think that's, sort of the contradictory nature of the self, and it's part of the pluralistic nature of our country.